consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise once again to address the Supreme Court vacancy created by the untimely death of Justice Antonin Scalia. The Constitution gives the nomination power to the President and gives the advice and consent power to the Senate, but does not tell either how to exercise their power. Our job of advice and consent begins with deciding how best to exercise this power in each situation. And the Senate has done so in different ways at different times under different circumstances. And I don't think there's any question about that. For two reasons, I'm convinced that the best way to exercise our power of advice and consent regarding the Scalia vacancy is to defer the confirmation process until the current presidential election season, which I find horrific, is over. The first reason is that the circumstances we face today make this the wrong time for the confirmation process. This vacancy occurred in a presidential election year with the campaigns and voting already underway. Different parties control the nomination and confirmation phases of the judicial appointment process. The confirmation process, especially for Supreme Court nominees, has been racked by discord in the past. And this is one of the bitterest and dirtiest presidential campaigns we've seen in modern times. Combining a Supreme Court confirmation fight and a nasty presidential campaign would create the perfect storm that would do more harm than good for the court, the Senate, and of course our nation. The circumstances I mentioned are identical to those that led Vice President Biden in 1992 to recommend exactly what we are doing today. In June 1992, when he chaired the Judiciary Committee, he identified these very circumstances and concluded, you can see on this chart, he concluded, once the political season is underway, and it is, action on a Supreme Court nomination must be put off until after the election campaign is over, unquote. To be fair, something significant has changed since 1992. The confirmation process has become even more partisan, contentious, and divisive. In 2001, Democrats plotted a procedural revolution, launching new tactics to prevent Republican judicial nominees from being confirmed. Over the next several years, they led 20 filibusters of appeals court nominees and prevented several from ever getting appointed. Then in 2013, Democrats used a parliamentary maneuver to abolish the very filibusters they had used so aggressively. The minority leader knows this because he was in the middle of it all. If the condition of the confirmation process was bad enough in 1992 for Chairman Biden to recommend deferring it to a less politically charged time, Democrats' actions since then have only made this conclusion more compelling today. The second reason for deferring the confirmation process for the Scalia vacancy is that elections have consequences. The 2012 election obviously had consequences for the president and his power to nominate. But the 2014 election had its own consequences for the Senate and its power of advice and consent. A big reason that the American people gave Senate control to Republicans was to be a more effective check on how the president is exceeding his constitutional authority. The 2016 election also will have consequences for the judiciary. The timing of the Scalia vacancy creates a unique opportunity for the American people to voice their opinion about the direction of the courts. Mr. President, on Monday, the minority leader reminded us of an important axiom. Let me just refer to the chart again. No matter how many times you say a falsehood, it's still a falsehood. It's still false. I agree. The minority leader claims that the Senate has a constitutional duty, a constitutional obligation to hold a prompt hearing and timely floor vote for the president's nominee to the Scalia vacancy. The Hill yesterday quoted him saying this, quote, "The obligation is for them to hold hearings and to have a vote. That's in the Constitution," unquote. By my count, the minority leader has made this claim here on the Senate floor more than 40 times. He said it as recently as this morning. Well, no matter how many times he says this falsehood, it is still false. The minority leader's claim is false because the Constitution says no such thing. This is what the Constitution actually says about appointing judges. Quote, "The President shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint," unquote. That's pretty clear. But the President has that absolute right of nomination, and we in the Senate have an absolute right on advice and consent. Nothing about hearings or votes, nothing about a timetable or schedule. I say this to my Democratic colleagues. Do you really want to stand behind a completely fictional, patently false claim like that? Do you really want to base your position on what the Washington Post fact checker called a politically convenient fairy tale? I understand that you want the Senate to conduct the confirmation process now for the President's nominee. We can and should debate that. But will none of you be honest enough to at least say what everyone in this chamber knows? That the Constitution does not require us to do things that way. The minority leader not only contradicts the Constitution, he contradicts himself. The minority leader was serving here in the Senate in 1992. Senator Reid took no issue with Chairman Biden's conclusion that the circumstances at the time, the same circumstances that exist today, counseled deferring the confirmation process. Senator Reid did not tell Chairman Biden that the Senate must do its job. Senator Reid did not assert then what he repeats so often today, that the Senate has a constitutional duty to give nominees prompt hearings and timely floor votes. On May 19, 2005, during the debate on the nomination of Priscilla Owen to the U.S. Court of Appeals, the minority leader said of the Constitution, and I'll just refer to this chart again, quote, "Nowhere in that document does it say the Senate has a duty to give presidential appointees a vote," unquote. In that 2005 speech, the minority leader was particularly adamant about this point, claiming that the Senate has a duty to promptly consider each nominee and give them an up or down vote, he said, would, quote, "rewrite the Constitution and reinvent reality," unquote. That's what the minority leader said then, when the circumstances were changed, of course. Today, the political shoe is on the minority leader's other foot, and he is the one claiming that nominees must have prompt consideration and up or down votes. By his own standard, the minority leader is rewriting the Constitution and reinventing reality. Now that it serves his own political interests and that of his party, the minority leader has reversed course and claimed in a recent Washington Post opinion column that the Senate has a constitutional duty to give nominees, quote, "a fair and timely hearing," unquote. Let me once again mention 1992, when Chairman Biden denied a hearing to more than 50 Republican judicial nominees. He allowed no hearing at all, whether fair or unfair, timely or otherwise. In September 1992, the New York Times reported on page 1 that this was part of an obstruction strategy to keep judicial vacancies open in the hope that Bill Clinton would be elected. Now, Senator Reid served here at that time, but I can find no record of him demanding that every nominee get a timely hearing. Instead, he wholeheartedly supported his party's strategy of obstruction. In his recent Washington Post column, the minority leader also wrote that the Senate has a constitutional duty to give nominees a floor vote. Between 2003 and 2007, however, he voted 25 times to deny any floor vote at all to Republican judicial nominees. As far as I can tell, we have the same Constitution today as we did in 1992, 2003, 2005, and 2007. We have the same Constitution today with a Democrat in the White House as we did in the past with a Republican president in the White House. The minority leader cannot have it both ways. He cannot today insist that the Constitution requires the very hearings and floor votes that he and his fellow Democrats blocked in the past. Now, I suppose they'll say, well, those were lesser court judges. Well, they were still judicial nominees. On Monday, the minority leader again attacked the Judiciary Committee and its distinguished chairman, Senator Grassley. Now, you've got to go a long way to find anybody who's nicer, more competent, and more dedicated than Senator Grassley. And yet he was being attacked again. I guess they think that somehow makes a difference. The minority leader held up a quote from an editorial in an Iowa paper about how the chairman is conducting the confirmation process. I don't know when the minority leader started caring about what hometown newspaper editorials said about the confirmation process, but this appears to be yet another epiphany. On February 19, 2003, the Reno Gazette-Journal criticized Democrats for their filibuster of Miguel Estrada to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And everybody, including us on our side, knew that that was a position that this wonderful Hispanic person could assume that he was on his way to the Supreme Court. Everybody knew it. A few weeks later, the Las Vegas Review-Journal editorial called the filibuster campaign, promoted by Senator Reid, quote, nothing more than ideological posturing and partisan bluster, unquote. As I mentioned earlier, the minority leader went on to vote 25 times for filibusters of Republican judicial nominees. Also on Monday, the minority leader claimed that the Judiciary Committee is not doing its job and that the chairman is, quote, taking his marching orders from the Republican leader, unquote. Later in the day, the Senate unanimously passed the Defend Trade Secrets Act, which I authored with Senator Chris Coons, a truly bipartisan bill that we worked hard on and that the Senate was blessed by. The minority leader dismissed this legislative accomplishment because it was reported out of the Judiciary Committee unanimously. He said, quote, I don't see today why the Judiciary Committee should be given a few pats on the back, unquote. Well, that's okay with me. We don't need pats on the back. The minority leader knows better, though. He knows that the strong bipartisan outcome for this legislation was the result of nearly 2 years of work behind the scenes, primarily at the staff level. It is painfully obvious that the minority leader desperately wants to score political points and to spin everything he can to his advantage. But to disparage and belittle the arduous work of both Democrats and Republicans by both staff and senators is disgraceful and really insulting. Before he denigrated this significant bipartisan achievement, he should have read the Obama administration's statement of policy on the bill. The Defend Trade Secrets Act will, the administration says, promote innovation and help minimize threats to American businesses, the economy, and national security interests. The Obama administration calls this an, quote, important piece of legislation, unquote, that would, quote, provide important protection to the nation's businesses and industries, unquote. Well, Mr. President, this morning the minority leader once again said that the Senate must do its job regarding the Scalia vacancy, and he asked, quote, what is that job, unquote? The Senate's job is to determine how best to exercise its advice and consent power under the particular circumstances we face today. We have made that determination. We have done our job. We are making the same determination that the minority leader apparently supported in 1992. The Constitution no more dictates our decision than it did in 2009 when the minority leader correctly said that the Senate is not required to vote on nominations. No matter how many times you say a falsehood, it's still false. No matter how many times the minority leader falsely claims that the Constitution dictates how and when the Senate must contain or conduct the confirmation process, it is still false. No matter how many times he claims that the Senate is not doing its job, it is still false. No matter how many times the minority leader questions the integrity and character of the Judiciary Committee chairman, those questions are still false. No matter how many times the minority leader contradicts himself and tries to avoid his own judicial confirmation record, his claims today are still false. The Senate today has the same power of advice and consent as when Democrats were the majority. We have the same responsibility to determine the best way to exercise that power in each situation. In 1992, Chairman Biden recommended deferring the confirmation process so that, quote, partisan bickering and political posturing, unquote, did not overwhelm everything else. The false claims and disreputable tactics being used today, including by the minority leader, confirm Chairman Biden's judgment and its application even more today. Well, it's disappointing to me, to be honest with you. We have an honest disagreement as to when this nomination should be brought up. We have an honest disagreement as to how it should be brought up. We have an honest disagreement about the times that we're in. We think that this presidential race is a horrific presidential race on both sides. And I, for one, as former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and as somebody who has always worked very hard on the Judiciary Committee, am very, very concerned that we bring up this nominee in the middle of this awful mess called the presidential election, with all of the politics and screaming and shouting and arguing and blasting of each side. It demeans the court. It demeans what we're trying to do around here. And it makes sense in the